The great advantage of studying the original plan for Hadrian's Wall and its immediate successor is that we can observe and interpret the original proposal, Plan A, and we can observe and interpret a very different successor plan, Plan B. And through this compare and contrast process, move towards an understanding of the purpose of the frontier and the way the army intended it to operate. Once we move away from that brief period, we are faced with a number of problems. The first issue is dating the changes to the frontier, and the second, the lack of modern excavations. Over the last 50 years, only 7 turrets have been excavated, and only 2 milecastles, though only 1 has been published. The lack of excavations has been compounded by the destruction of the upper layers of several turrets, so we do work from partial evidence. There have been extensive excavations at several forts and smaller investigations at others, as well as sections cut across the vallum. What we have not done is much by way of investigations of areas outside the military compounds. Here the main exception is Vindolanda, where fort, extramural settlement and cemetery have all been and continue to be excavated. We will come to the work there in the next lecture. In the meantime, we have to make sense of what information we have to illustrate the history of the wall and any changing patterns in the way it operated. Hadrian's successor, Antoninus Pius, at the very beginning of his reign in 138, took a decision to move the frontier forward in Britain. I remain firm in the belief that the reason was political. The new emperor, who had never served in the army, required military prestige, and like Claudius 100 years before, he chose to obtain it in Britain. Within months of his accession, plans had been prepared, as indicated by the building work at Corbridge on the main eastern route north. By the summer of 142, victory had been achieved and a start made on building the Antonine Wall. The life of this frontier was short, as an inscription demonstrates building work on Hadrian's Wall in 158 from the consular date. The details of the Antonine Wall do not concern us, but the effect on Hadrian's Wall does. In their excavations at Milecastle 48 in 1909, Gibson and Simpson found in the debris between the first and second phases of occupation 2 worn but broken pivot stones. As no earlier pivot stones were found, they inferred that these came from the lowest level of the gateway, the damage resulting from their removal. About the same time, the gaps in the mounds of the vallum were recognized, and it became realized that this earthwork had also been slighted. In short, when Hadrian's Wall was abandoned in favor of its northern successor, measures were taken to allow traffic to proceed across the military zone unimpeded. This in itself indicates that the army was not concerned with internal security. On the return from the Antonine Wall, steps were taken to put Hadrian's Wall back into working order. New pivots were placed in Milecastle passageways to allow gates to be rehung. Turrets were reoccupied, as were forts, if they had been previously abandoned, which in many cases we don't know, and a start was made on restoring the vallum to its original purpose. The main change at this time appears to have been on the Cumbrian coast. We can point to no tower that was reoccupied, though there is a little evidence, structural evidence, for changes at some of the fortlets believed to have been at this time. No fortlet, however, is known to have remained occupied after the end of the 2nd century. The only new element appears to have been the creation of a road along the wall, the Military Way. There was a catastrophic event in the early 180s when the tribes crossed the wall that divided them from the Roman forts, did a great deal of damage, and defeated an army killing its general, probably the governor of the province. Cassius Dio stated that this was the greatest war of the reign of Commodus. This is a remarkable statement. The only other war which Dio mentioned in the reign of Commodus was with the barbarians beyond Dacia, but the British war occurred immediately after the end of the long-running struggle on the Danube, for which Commodus had taken the title of Imperator 3 times. The British war was clearly very serious. The evidence for destruction at various sites along the wall is related to this event. What is more significant to the operation of Hadrian's Wall are the changes which were made to the frontier in the following years. These have been recognized in turrets, milecastles, and in the units based in the forts. The most significant change was the near whole-scale abandonment of turrets, a conclusion based on the lack of 2nd century pottery in most structures. This again is remarkable, but perhaps not as surprising than it might appear at first sight. We know of no certain towers on the Antonine Wall. We have assumed that we've been unable to find them. But if Plan B for Hadrian's Wall reduced the value of the towers along that frontier, the next step may have been the complete abandonment of the concept on the Antonine Wall. The return to Hadrian's Wall resulted in the abandonment of the towers along the Cumbrian coast, with those of the wall following later. Again, I repeat, this was remarkable. The tower was one of the staple elements in the Roman military portfolio throughout the empire. To eliminate nearly all the towers from Hadrian's Wall is not what we would expect. What were the implications? The purpose of the tower was observation and/or signalling, that is, assuming that it was not simply a glorified sentry box. On Hadrian's Wall, we assume that their primary purpose was observation. As we have seen the work of David Woolliscroft on the close relationship between the milecastles on the wall and the troops based in the forts to the south along the Staingate, implies a method of communication between the two. This further implies that the soldiers in the turrets were occupied in observing any movement in the lands to the north and, when necessary, sending back a message. There's a torch to do it. If there is any traction in this argument, the placing of forts on the wall line will have ended this arrangement, so the soldiers would now have to send a message along the wall. In itself, this does not mean that the purpose of the turrets was at an end. What is more likely to have led to an appreciation that they were surplus to requirements was the placing of the forts on the wall, with the clear implication from their positions that the army intended to be involved in operations to the north. We might presume that in the future observation was to be mainly undertaken in the field by the soldiers in the forts and not from the towers on the wall. The abandonment of the turrets appears to have taken place in two stages. At first, the door may have been blocked up. This is indicated at some by courses of stone, as here, placed on the door thresholds, but we cannot always be certain that these do not relate to a raising of the threshold. The second more definitive stage was the demolition of the turret and the infilling of the recess where the turret was formerly on its north side embedded in the wall. The latter action has caused considerable discussion. Why were the recesses blocked up? It could be argued that it was to ensure the stability of that section of the wall, but the north wall of the turret was 4 feet, 1.2 meters wide, and faced on both sides, so capable of remaining standing. Another suggestion is that the infilling of the recess was to support a wall walk, but one would then expect a uniform blocking of recesses, which was not the case, as there are half a dozen instances where the recess was not infilled. A couple of planks thrown across the gap would have maintained a wall walk, assuming one existed, but we are unlikely ever to know whether this occurred. The blocking of recesses does not seem to me to offer unqualifying support to the existence of a wall walk. Another nail in the coffin, in my view. It should be noted that at least 9 turrets were not demolished, though it is not easy to see why these survive. The only area with any uniformity of approach is the central sector between the arrows from 33B through to 45B. Each turret was demolished, and where the evidence survives, the recess was blocked up. East of the crags, it is a different story. 3 or 4 turrets appear not to have been demolished, nor have their recesses blocked up. In wall mile 19, which is there, the recess was infilled at one turret, while that at its neighbour was not. West of the crags, the situation is similar, with one turret demolished and the recess blocked up, while others in the same area survived, the yellow dots. There was no uniformity of approach. Perhaps the army simply responded to local circumstances. This was, I think, the last map I prepared, and as I added the yellow dots to the left, I realized where they all were. They were in the strategic Irthing-Tipalt gap here, where you got valleys coming from the north, which apparently through the whole life of fortifications on the North Isthmus had a greater number of defensive structures. It's the value of creating a map. To turn to milecastles, the signal stage here was the narrowing of the north and sometimes the south gate passages at several milecastles and the blocking of one gate completely. It might be thought that such action in the crag sector, where there was a drop in front of the gate, would be no more than an acceptance of reality. But not all these milecastles stood on a cliff. There is some evidence that the narrowing was the natural next step in the use of milecastles. Some secondary pivots show much less wear than the original stones, indicating less use. In such instances, the next step would appear to have been to restrict the use of the gate even more. Humphrey Welfare has suggested that it is likely that most of the causeways over the wall ditch in front of the milecastle gates were removed at the same time, thereby further reducing the value of the gates. What we can conclude from this discussion of the turrets and milecastles is a reduction in the importance of these minor installations along the barrier. Many towers were dispensed with, and it would appear that it was now no longer possible for vehicular traffic to pass through the wall at milecastles, and no longer possible to cross the wall ditch at this point. The wall had simply become a barrier. Perhaps it should then come as no surprise to observe that the vallum was falling out of use, at least around the forts, so as we can see from the spread of civil settlements over its earthworks. What then of the forts themselves? Most of our evidence for the regiments based in the forts in the frontier zone dates to the early 3rd century, the reign of Septimius Severus and his immediate successors, homologated in most cases through the record of the Notitia Dignitatum, a document recording the officials of the Roman Empire in about 400, 200 years later, that is. As we have seen, Severus is credited in the ancient sources as building the wall, so we can only presume he did something, but what? There is little direct evidence. An inscription from Antiquarian near Castlestead, which you've all seen in the local in the newspapers in the last week, reporting on the new survey work being carried out here, An inscription in a quarry near Castlestead provides a consular date for work here in 207, but we have no idea where the stone was used. It is frequently stated that the hard white mortar used in the extra narrow wall is Severan in date, but this is not necessarily the case, for Bidwell and Holbrook recognise the early use of the same style of mortar at Willeford Bridge in an earlier context. The Severan date for this hard white mortar goes back to 1911, when Simpson, in the publication of Milecastles 48, referred to the Severan rebuild of the wall, specifically relating it to the ancient record, and the date has simply stuck. We have no archaeological evidence for any activities on the wall under Severus. The ancient sources, however, may provide a clue to Severus's actions. There is no literary reference to Hadrian's Wall before the arrival in Britain of the imperial family in 208. The single reference to Britain between 197 and 208 is that probably in 206, Severus was angry that wars were being won in Britain while he could not capture a bandit in Italy. Inscriptions are testimony to the activities of his governors. While they were at work on the wall forts and at an outpost fort, they also restored military buildings at forts in the hinterland, as far south as Ribchester and in Wales. They were energetic. Perhaps there had been a lack of maintenance. Further, the activity continued into the 230s. That's over a 30-year period. There was clearly work to be done, for gates were restored from their foundations, buildings collapsed through old age were rebuilt, and new facilities provided. The work was a continuous process through the reigns of all the emperors of the Severan dynasty. It is against this background that we should measure the literary sources. It is unfortunate that neither of our principal sources, the closest to the events they were describing, mention the building of a wall. There is only one later source, repeated many times, which recorded that Severus led, that's the verb used, a wall across the island. This action is always placed after his campaigning in Scotland, which finished in 211. Tony Burley has suggested that his son and successor, Caracalla, magnified the importance of the reconstruction of Hadrian's Wall, having abandoned the conquests in Scotland after Severus's death, when his army returned, what his army returned to after 3 years of activity in the north was Hadrian's Wall. Perhaps our single late source is merely acknowledging this. This excursus has revealed that we have no evidence that Severus did anything to Hadrian's Wall other than leave his governors to undertake repairs at some forts. Analysis of epigraphic evidence, admittedly scarce, reveals several regiments occupying their forts on and behind the wall, both before and after the Severan campaigns. Some from as early as the 180s, one from as early as 150s. A map of military deployment in northern Britain in the early 3rd century is particularly interesting. It is at this time that we have the most evidence for the disposition of units. There are 4 cavalry units on the wall, all in blue. It is at this, to the south in the west, 3 cavalry units are based in the forts leading north to Carlisle and Stanwick, while in the east there are 2 more, one on each road south. This is unlikely to be the result of happenstance, but it is more likely to be a carefully arranged pattern of military deployment. Further south at Lancaster and Ribchester, there were also cavalry units, Green Stars, of course, and they were placed where they were able to move north swiftly should they be required on the frontier. The evidence that we have points to the major changes on the wall, including the abandonment of turrets and the narrowing of milecastle gates, together with amendments to military deployment taking place in the aftermath of the invasion of the early 180s. The result was that the importance of the wall itself and the strengthening of military deployment in the frontier zone, which started under Hadrian, reached its maturity in the late 1st century, even though we might only see the new pattern clearly in the early decades of the following century. The significant addition to the military dispositions of the late 2nd century, which we can also only see clearly in the early 3rd century, are the outpost or advance forts. In Hadrian's Plan B for the wall, there were 3 outpost forts to the west, Bewcastle, Netherby and Birons. Only Bewcastle and Netherby survived the 180s when they were supplemented by Risingham and High Rochester in the east. Risingham and High Rochester shared with some of the wall forts a phenomenon recognized through inscriptions of the early 3rd century, the addition of other units to their basic complement. These forts include Housesteads, Great Chesters, and Bruff-by Sands. To the north, there were scouts at Risingham and High Rochester. The scouts recorded that these forts roamed into the lands across the Cheviots, leaving inscriptions which were reused in the monastery at Jedburgh. That's the most northerly dot. To the west, the name of Netherby was Castra Exploratorum, the fort of the scouts. We cannot explain the specific requirement for forts along the wall to be strengthened by the stationing there of additional units. That is, apart from a desire of the Romans to protect the province and impose their will beyond the frontier, in relation to which the involvement of scouts at 3 of the 4 outpost forts is certainly understandable. Involvement by Rome in the affairs of states beyond her borders had long been a significant activity. They deposed kings and appointed new ones at will. They sought to control access to the lands immediately beyond the frontier, as attested on both the Rhine and the Danube. In one treaty between the Romans and the Marcomanni, there was a stipulation that the Marcomanni, in their own lands, should not assemble often, nor in many parts of the country, but only once each month, and in one place, and in the presence of a Roman centurion. In Britain, the treaties which the Caledonians and the Maiotai broke in 197 had previously, presumably, been established in the aftermath of the 184 victory, and it was these treaties that were renewed when Caracalla abandoned his father's conquest in 211. 150 years later, in 360, the savage tribes of the Scots and the Picts disrupted the agreed peace. Note that there appears to have been a treaty with the Scots, presumably still in Ireland. 7 years later, there was the so-called barbarian conspiracy. This may have been no worse than the events of 360. It was just that the Roman counterattack was led by the father of the emperor, under whom the Durator Ammianus was writing. But his account contains a crucial piece of evidence. The Ariani, a word that we cannot translate but may relate to open spaces, was an organization founded in earlier times. Their official duty was to range backwards and forwards over long distances with information for our generals about disturbances among neighbouring nations. A classic description of scouts. The problem was that in 367, they had been bribed with promises of plunder to reveal the Romans' plans to the enemy. What we are seeing is a long period where scouts are used by the Romans in the lands to the north. Briberies, subsidies depending on your point of view, was another Roman weapon. We have already seen that peace had to be purchased in 197 by the payment of a considerable sum. Presumably the coin holds dating to the reign of Severus relate to this or to subsequent payments. Interestingly, these hoards, this is Fraser Hunter's maps, all lie north of the Tay in the lands of the Caledonians. The middle map. One of the troublemakers of 197. This is under Severus. After the withdrawal from Severus's northern conquest, the hordes of the next 25 years all lie in southern Scotland, a reversion to the distribution before Severus, their map to the left. There appears to be a long-running policy of keeping sweet the peoples living in the lands stretching up to the Tay. The pattern that we have been creating for the operation of the frontier zone in the late 2nd century and early 3rd century is a downgrading of the wall itself, the strengthening of some forces at some forts on the wall line, the creation of what might be termed a mobile support framework in the hinterland forts, the establishment of a system of scouting to the north of the wall based on 4 outpost or advanced forts, subsidies to the people living in southern Scotland, and treaty relationships with those beyond. This is the pattern which continues into the late 3rd century and in some elements beyond. We might call this Plan C. In some ways, we can see that Plan C is a developed version of Plan B, Hadrian's later plan, which saw a significant increase in the number of forts in the frontier zone, with the placing of forts astride the wall, signalling an intention to operate beyond the barrier. In Plan C, yet more troops were based on the wall, supported by cavalry regiments to the south, and with greater strengthening of military capabilities to the north. As John Mann pointed out, it is interesting that the Roman frontier now appears to have lain on the Cheviots, roughly the border between the later kingdoms of Scotland and England. We should not be overly surprised at this. There had been 2 serious wars in Britain within 50 years. In one, the army suffered a notable loss of men. In the second, a general being killed. The significance of this latter defeat may not have been forgotten by a future emperor and general in Britain, namely the Emperor Septimius Severus, then a legionary legate quite high up in the army in Syria. While contemporary writers offer various reasons for the campaigns of Severus in Britain, what is notable is that his intention, according to Dio, was to conquer the whole of the island. In other words, to do away with the frontier altogether. He pushed forward the frontier in the east in order for his new conquest to act as a bulwark against the Parthians, according to Dio. So there is no reason to doubt that his strategic sense could have been brought to bear on the issue of the British frontier. His death ended his vision, and Plan C remained in operation. The 3rd century is one of the problem periods in the history of the northern frontier. We have no literary references after the return to Rome of Caracalla in 211. The run of inscriptions flows to a trickle, after the end of the Severan dynasty in 235, concluding one recording the rebuilding of the bathhouse at Lancaster in the 260s. There are other inscriptions which demonstrate continuing military presences at several forts, at least into the 280s, but after Lancaster, we have to wait for another 40 years or thereabouts before another building inscription. Around 300, the commander's house, which is the right circle, and the headquarters building in the left circle, and the bathhouse, which we don't know where it was, at Berdwoswald, which had been covered with earth and fallen into ruins, were restored. At some time in the 3rd century, the wall immediately to the west of the fort, top left blue circle, was demolished and a ditch cut across its line. In some ways, this was a physical manifestation of the deterioration of the status of the wall itself, now just one element in a wide military zone stretching from York and Chester to the Cheviots and beyond. Severus divided the large province of Britannia into two, Upper Britain in the south and Lower Britain in the north. As amended, it would appear, by his son Caracalla, the governor of Lower Britain in the north controlled the legion at York, where he had his capital, and most of the auxiliary units in the island, but the other two legions lay in the upper province at Chester and Caerleon. In some ways, this does not appear to have mattered overmuch, as we do have evidence for the two southern legions operating in the north. In spite of the smaller forces available to the governor in the north, we know of no disturbances on the frontier from the time of Caracalla in 211 almost through to the end of the century, when the Picts first appear in the literature. This, of course, is not to say that nothing happened. The so-called peace may justly reflect the paucity of our sources. Between 273 and 285, 4 emperors took the title Britannicus, suggesting something did happen. Aurelian, the brothers Carinus and Numerian, and Diocletian. The first may have been to mark the reabsorption of the breakaway Gallic Empire into central authority. And Diocletian may have taken the title simply to strengthen his own authority. Carinus was briefly emperor from 2 years, 283 to 5, in the west. But apart from the title, the only hint at campaigning is a poetic reference to a successful war under the North Star. Make of that what you will. While his brother Numerian only held the title as his co-emperor. In short, we do not know the reasons for these acclamations. One of the most imaginative approaches to the 3rd century was taken by John Mann in his paper on the northern frontier in 367, published in 1974. In this, he analysed the army list for Britain in the Notitia Dignitatum. This is the medieval copying of the page in the Notitia Dignitatum, referring to the command of the Duke of the Britons. As I said, this dates to about 400. Mann drew a distinction between the regiments of the early empire, the cohorts and alae, often named after their place of origin or their commanding officer, and the units created in the 4th century with bland names such as the Numerus Defensorum. Mann noted that while many of the units in the early empire continued to be recorded at the forts along the wall and the Cumbrian coast, those in the hinterland were occupied by the new style units, in some instances clearly replacing the units attested there in the early 3rd century. He noted that the units on the wall survived, so it could not be that the hinterland forts had been wiped out in an invasion. Rather, he argued that they had been disbanded or withdrawn for service elsewhere. We do not know when this happened, though it was presumably after the mid-260s, probably the 280s. We know, however, that while some new style units started to be created in the late 3rd century, it appears to have been Diocletian, emperor from 284 to 305, who raised new units and distributed them along the frontiers. Among these would appear to be the 13 regiments sent to, or possibly raised in Britain, which are all our blue stars. It would be helpful to man's thesis if we could point to forts which were unoccupied sometime from, say, the mid-60s, 260s, through to the 320s, or later, but this is difficult. There has been little or no excavation at most forts in the hinterland of the wall to help answer the question. On top of this are the difficulties of interpreting both coin loss and pottery patterns at sites which have been excavated. As was noted in the report on the excavation at Milvian Bridge, the pottery indicated occupation throughout the Roman period, but it was not possible to determine whether there were intervals in the tenure of the site. And then there may be difficulties in determining who was living in a fort. Could forts be maintained with a caretaker detachment? What happened on abandonment? Destruction of the buildings, as would have happened in the 1st century, or the locking of the front door? Did someone else move in? Paul Buckland reviewed the evidence for Malton and concluded that it was possible that the fort was either completely abandoned or held by only a caretaker garrison from the mid-3rd century until early in the 4th. On the evidence from Doncaster, he said that although it remained a military site, inactivity brought a decline in standards, and the nature of late 3rd century occupation remains enigmatic. In size, it could have been a fort or a small defended civil settlement, none of the internal structures being diagnostic, and the presence of late Roman military equipment would not be unusual in a tower. In other way of putting it, we are in a fix. In the face of these archaeological problems, I prefer to accept the analysis of John Mann, a scholar who had studied the literary and documentary evidence across the empire, even though his conclusions were dismissed by Shepherd Freer as frankly unbelievable. After all, what is the alternative? That a diktat was issued stating that about half the regiments forming the army of Britain should change their names overnight. The answer is that across the Roman Empire, new units with strange names were created and assigned to the frontier regions, and this happened in Britain as elsewhere. Can we seek occasions when the forts in the Pennines might have been abandoned? For John Mann, the reason behind the reduction in the army of Britain was the long period of peace in the frontier regions from 211 onwards. We could suggest 2 occasions unrelated to peace in Britain when troops might have been withdrawn from the island. The first was the 50 years of civil war and invasions throughout the empire, from the death of Severus Alexander in 235 to the accession of Diocletian in 284. In these years, troops might have been withdrawn from Britain to feed the frantic struggles on the continent. The 260s and the 270s in particular were years of crisis, with Dacia across the Danube and the agridecumates between the headwaters of the Rhine and Danube abandoned, followed by southern Mauritania Tingitana in the late 280s. The end of the coin series sites along Hadrian's Wall in the 270s might reflect troop withdrawals in these particular crises. The second possible occasion was the period of civil war following the abdication of Diocletian in 305. At one point in the years between 305 and 326, there were no less than 6 emperors. The eventual winner was Constantine I. The victory which turned the tide in his favour was at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in October 312. I'm sorry it was such a gloomy day when I went. When Constantine placed the Christian symbol on the military flags. If you want to see a Roman military flag, go into a church. The Mothers' Union banner is the lineal descendant of the Roman military flag. You can use that as your party piece anytime you like. It has been argued on the basis of the coinage that in preparing for the battle, which we know as Milvian Bridge, Constantine came to Britain and abandoned the outpost forts so as to incorporate their regiments into his army. It is perhaps unlikely that Constantine would go to so much trouble for just 4 units, even though they were probably all 1,000-strong regiments. So it is possible that he swept more up into his army. To return to slightly more solid ground, Plan D, insofar as it was a plan, and not just a reaction to imperial requirements, appears to have been a running down of the army of Britain, with regiments in the hinterland forts either abandoned or moved elsewhere, and perhaps detachments withdrawn from other forts, leaving smaller forts based there. The notitia list indicates that the legion survived at York, and that most of the units along the wall and down the Cumbrian coast as far as Ravenclass, the forts built as part of Hadrian's Plan B note, the forts along the western seaboard may have been retained owing to raiding from Ireland, as implied in the panegyric of Constantius Chlorus in 297, when the Hibernians were stated to be a threat to the province. Military deployment in Plan D was thin. Whether this was the result of peace on the northern frontier or requirements for troops elsewhere is a moot point. What we can acknowledge is that when Rome let slip her guard, when she was preoccupied with problems elsewhere, her enemies frequently took advantage of the situation. In time, Plan D came face to face with reality. The threats posed to the British provinces throughout the 4th century. Shortly after the year 300, we have the first references to Picts and Hibernians. In 305, the Emperor Constantius and his son Constantine came to Britain and campaigned against the Picts, victory being acclaimed on the 7th of January 306. We must assume that the situation was serious, as it brought Constantius, newly acclaimed emperor, to the outer fringes of the empire. Although Constantius had been Caesar, that is, at this time, nominated successor to the Western emperor for 12 years, the announcement of the succession to the reigning emperors, Diocletian and Maximian, on the 1st of May 305 did not go according to plan. In Milan, Constantius was duly declared emperor, but in the east his son Constantine was passed over for the appointment of Caesar. This was totally unexpected. The situation was tense. Constantine was allowed to go to his father, then in Gaul, and together they crossed to Britain to campaign against the Picts. This must have taken place late in 305, and that underlines the seriousness of the situation on the northern frontier. For in a tense political situation, it is unwise to banish yourself to the edge of the world without due cause. In this case, had the Picts and the Hibernians recognized the weakness of the Roman army in Britain, had they seen the defect of Plan D. 6 months after the announcement of victory, Constantius, still in Britain, died on the 25th of July, 306, and his son Constantine was proclaimed emperor in York, departing the island to begin his long struggle for supremacy. I cannot resist putting this on. The sort of fey way he's holding his right hand doesn't sort of contrast to me with the bloodthirsty character that he actually was. In the winter of 3423, there was such a serious situation that it brought Constans, the son of Constantine, to Britain, where the Britons quailed before the face of an unexpected emperor. The visit was recorded by Ammianus in a lost book, but his later reference to the event does include mention of the Picts and the Scots. The 360s, as we've seen, were a difficult decade for Britain. In 360, the Picts and the Scots, this is the Pict, attacked. In 364, the Picts, Saxons, Scots, and Antiquarii, another Irish people, are listed. And in 367, the Picts and the Scots and the Antiquarii attacked. In 382, the usurper Magnus Maximus campaigned against the Picts and the Scots, defeating them. About 400 Silico, ruler of the empire under the effete Honorius, did something of an uncertain nature to protect the island, and about this time a field army was detached to reinforce the army of Britain. This is in itself is a reflection not only of the seriousness of the pressures on the northern frontier of Britain, but of the intention to retain the island. It is presumably this attitude which had led to the reinforcement of the army of Britain through previous dispatch of new style units. If we look at a map of occupied forts, we can see that military deployment in North Britain was similar to that in the 2nd century, based on the roads leading to the northern frontier. There is no evidence that the people living south of the wall were restless at any time during the Roman period. There is, however, a new issue to contend with: the size of the regiments in the late Roman army. This is a troublesome subject because we have so little evidence. About the only agreement we can achieve is that the regiments were smaller than before. The strength of a legion reduced from about 5,000 to about 1,000, while the size of some regiments appeared to have been less than 100, down from 500. Archaeological evidence is not as helpful as we would like. At South Shields, Wallsend, Housesteads, and probably Vindolanda, barracks with 4, 5, and 6 rooms have been recorded instead of the earlier 8, 9, or 10. This type of barracks first appears in the 230s and 240s, but any suggestion that they imply reduced numbers of men must be treated with caution. For when the total floor area of the 6 barrack rooms of 4th century housesteads at the bottom are compared with the 10 rooms of their 2nd century predecessor, they're almost the same. Smaller units, of course, had an effect on the size of the whole army, and by implication on the size of the enemy forces it faced. It is noteworthy that while the newly built forts of the late empire had high walls and were strongly defended, none of these features were introduced to the Hadrian's Wall forts. Many fort gates were completely blocked by the later 4th century, and wide ditches were dug, but the latest known repair to fort walls produced earthen banks. We might conclude from this that the enemies that the Romans faced on the northern frontier were not as troublesome as those harassing the west and southern coasts of Britain. We do have references to the activities of the Picts in the last decades of the 4th century, but no reference to them attacking the wall. For all we know, the Picts sailed down the east coast, bypassing the wall altogether in 367, which might have been the reasons for the construction of the fortlets cum towers along the Yorkshire coasts shortly after this event. Yet this is a conundrum. How do we relate the literary evidence for warfare with the lack of modern Roman military architecture in the northern forts? What about Hadrian's Wall itself? At least 10 milecastles are known to have remained occupied into the 4th century, but only 3 turrets can be shown to have been occupied into the later years of the 4th century. As for the wall itself, there is little we can say. Bede records it still standing 12 feet high, presumably at the east end, and on High Shields Crags, excavation has revealed a wall standing 10.5 feet, 3.3 meters high, not far short of 12 feet, that is, to a level mortared flat top. This itself, however, does not imply a regular maintenance program for the wall, just that the wall was sturdy enough to survive. It is often assumed that somehow the wall was run down in its last years, but there is little evidence for this. Collins and Hodgson have drawn attention to changes in the late 4th century, including the arrangements within barracks and houses, to the appearance of areas of crude paving, to a lack of maintenance of roads, to the replacement of buildings and the repair of fort walls, though in a less formal style. Nor should we necessarily mistake crudeness for decadence. As the excavators point out in their report on Milecastle 35, regarded in isolation, the 4th century sewing shields represented something of a decline in the style of life on the site, or at least its structures seem more crude than their predecessors. The metalworking deposits indicate, however, that life was far from basic. Coins, too, might be taken into account. This is as horrible as it looks. As evidence for activity even into the 5th century, for it was presumably through the army that these coins arrived on the wall. It is believed that little bronze coinage was sent to Britain after 395, so soldiers were no longer paid in specie, but in kind. Some later coins have been found at northern sites, but worn, slightly earlier coins have been recovered from other sites. Collins has recently published a small group, of which this is one, perhaps the contents of a purse found at Great Whittington, 2 kilometres north of Halton Chesters. The latest of 8 coins dates to 406 to 8, nor is it alone. A hoard nearby hidden on the wall included a coin of Arcadius, the Eastern emperor issued at the same time. What we might regard as the last plan for Hadrian's Wall, Plan E, dating to the last years of the 4th century and presumably continuing into the early 5th, was not so different from its late 2nd century predecessor. The wall itself survived with some milecastles in use, but hardly any turrets, at least so far as we can see. Although the outpost forts had been abandoned, there was a wide military zone to the south, with regiments focused on the 2 main gates through the wall. What is different is the smaller number of troops involved. Hitherto, the legions had provided a backup force, but they had either been removed or considerably reduced in size. To replace them, a new mobile force was required, and this is what had been provided almost as the clock struck midnight. I have identified, at least to my own satisfaction, 5 different plans, and I use the term loosely, for Hadrian's Wall over the period of 300 years of its occupation. The first plan was for a barrier with gates at every mile and towers every third of a mile along its entire length and in the west beyond, placed in front of an existing line of forts. A relatively small force spread along the line would have been charged with the duty of frontier control, while the defense of the province lay with the regiments spread across the country to the south. This was of its day. I would argue that it developed out of the measures Trajan undertook to protect frontiers so as to allow him to undertake wars elsewhere, coupled with Hadrian's obvious intention to avoid further expansion. Before this scheme was completed, 20 or so regiments were moved into the frontier zone and dispersed along the line from near the mouth of the Tyne to Ravenglass on the Cumbrian coast. Control was tightened by the construction of the vallum, running along nearly the whole length of the wall immediately to its south. This was Plan B. We might see it as a reflection of reality. A wall would not stop an army, and it was an army which had given the Romans a bloody nose. Only men would do that, and this underpins Hadrian's actions in transferring so many regiments into the frontier zone. So many, too, intended to operate north of the wall and sealing off this military zone by the creation of a vallum to the south. The Antonine War came and went, but it seems to have been the major invasion of the early 180s which led to a reappraisal of the wall. Again, we can see a strategic reaction to the threat from the north. More troops were based in the wall forts. Military deployment to the south was carefully arranged so that cavalry units were focused on the 2 main roads through the wall, and advanced forts were occupied with at least 3 serving as the bases for scouts, with soldiers operating beyond the Cheviers. The measures undertaken for the defense of the empire were pushed closer to the enemy. Military dispositions were supplemented by treaties with the Caledonians and the Maeotai recorded in the late 2nd century and in the payment of subsidies. The result was that the role of the wall and its structures was reduced. The towers along the Cumbrian coast had already been abandoned. Now, many, perhaps most turrets on the wall were abandoned. Milecastles survived and into the 4th century, but had their north gates narrowed and most causeways across the wall ditch removed. This was Plan C. This plan lasted well into the 3rd century, and its very success may have been the cause of its decline. It may have been the peace which seems to have lasted through most of the century that led to the disappearance of many units from the hinterland of the wall, but equally possible was a requirement of emperors for troops for their wars, as has been argued for the abandonment of the advance force. The units along the frontier zone from South Shields to Ravenglass remained, but it seems probable that they contained fewer soldiers. Milecastles continued in use, but the separation of the fort at Burdosdruld from the wall is telling. This was Plan D. Sometime in the 4th century, a dozen new-style units were sent to Britain, occupying the forts in the hinterland abandoned earlier, but not the advanced forts. These new regiments may have served the same function as their late 2nd and 3rd century predecessors, that of support to the troops on the wall. The flanks of the wall were protected by some forts along the west coast. New fort was built at Lancaster, for example, and the fortlets along the eastern littoral here. At the very end of the 4th century, the army of Britain was strengthened by the addition of a field army. This was Plan E. And again, we should see it as relating to the threat from the north and now the west. These plans represent an organic development lasting over a period of nearly 300 years. In effect, no new plan for Hadrian's Wall was created after the first, that which may have been cooked up in a palace on the lower Danube. Each new plan was an adaptation of its predecessor. Nothing else was possible without the obliteration of the wall to create a tabula rasa for a totally new frontier on its line, and that did not happen. We only see that in the Antonine Wall. It is therefore not surprising that the pattern of military deployment and the occupation of wall installations in its last days was so similar to that of the mature wall 200 years before. After all, the same geographical rules applied, and the threat came from the same place. Here lie the roots of the northern frontier of Roman Britain, the failure to conquer the whole island. What happened, or rather failed to happen in Britain, was part of the general failure of the Romans to complete their destiny and conquer the whole world. At perhaps no other time was this more manifest than the reign of Trajan. His attempts to protect Rome's frontiers while indulging in costly, and in the case of Parthia, unsuccessful warfare can be identified in Britain as in Germany. In the case of the Tyne-Solway Isthmus, it was the addition of forts, small forts and towers to the existing few bases. The next step was the construction of substantial linear barriers. With hindsight, we can see that proactive warfare could only be carried out if all activities elsewhere were closed down and protective measures undertaken. Here was the genesis of Hadrian's Wall. Thereafter, the pattern was set. The most notable change is that of the late 2nd century. As in so much of life, it appears to have taken some years for the penny to drop, for it to be realized that once troops were placed on the wall line, much of the original plan was redundant. Hence the abandonment of so many towers, the restrictions in the use of milecastles, and the abandonment of the vallum, at least around forts. The wall remained a strong visible feature in the landscape, but what actually did it do? The front line lay far to the north. The increase in the number of soldiers in several of the wall forts points to proactive military activity. This underlines the position of Collingwood and Mann that the wall was irrelevant to military defence. At the end of our book, Hadrian's Wall, Brian and I wrote, "There is little evidence for Saxons and none for Picts or Scots on Hadrian's Wall, and the wall can therefore truly be said to have successfully served its purpose." But what did we mean by the wall? Surely not the bare stone barrier. It was the soldiers who happened to be placed on the wall that achieved its purpose. What effect these had on the surrounding people is another matter, and this is the subject of my next lecture tomorrow. Thank you.